Hi Guy, Drew here with Drew's Cues on music history. Today, we're going to talk about music in the Middle Ages. Wait, Drew, weren't the Middle Ages like 1,000 years ago? Yes, they were, and it was the evolution of music notation in the Middle Ages from non-existent to a system that mapped out both pitch and rhythm that paved the way for the music notation that we use today. Let's dive in. Exactly were the Middle Ages and what we would call medieval music today. The Middle Ages period is generally recognized to be from 476 AD to 1450 AD, so almost a 1,000-year period. 476 AD was the end of the Western Roman Empire and considered to be the end of the antiquity. Somewhere around 1450 AD, this middle or medieval period blended into what is called the Renaissance period and what we now refer to as the modern era. And you might think, well, 1450 doesn't sound very modern, but that's a topic for another day. Now, turning to music in this period, we can separate it into three different segments: sacred music, secular vocal music, and instrumental music. Sacred or church music could only be vocal, as the only instrument allowed in the church was the organ. Right now, we're going to focus mostly on the sacred vocal music, and you'll understand why as we go through. And let me note that some of this will be a little bit oversimplified. So let me know in the comments below if you're interested about any of these things in particular, and I may get deeper into some of these later on. Today, we kind of take for granted that to some extent, everyone can read. And most people, to some extent, have some knowledge of reading sheet music, or at the very least, recognize it when they see it. In the 5th century, or the beginning of the Middle Ages, literacy was mostly limited to the monasteries and to the monks within them. Almost all music up to this point was passed down orally and was not written down anywhere. For those reasons, the music from that period that we still have available to study today is almost exclusively sacred music. With that in mind, let's talk about chant, which is also known as plain chant. Plain because the melodies were all monophonic, meaning that they had no harmonies and no accompaniment, just the melody on its own, and chant coming from the Latin cantare, or the Old French chant, which mean sing. We know that some form of chant was present as part of the Roman Catholic Mass in the 4th century and definitely was an important part of the liturgy by the 5th century. As I said before, these earlier chants were not really written down, rather they were taught and passed down orally. Pope Gregory I sent trained singers all around the Holy Roman Empire in order to teach the proper liturgical chants for the Mass of the time. And that is why we often refer to sacred plain chant from the early Middle Ages as Gregorian chant, named after Pope Gregory I. It wasn't until sometime in the 9th century when monks in the monasteries began to create a music notation system using lines to represent the notes. This early version of the staff, as we call it today, only used the lines to represent the notes and not the spaces between the lines. So one line to the next line was one note to the next note. They used symbols called neumes, which were kind of a series of squares and rectangles and slashes to represent the melodies of the chants. But at this point, they didn't really have any kind of strict rhythmic system. The flow of the chants followed the rise and the fall of the melody, And so the rhythms were implied and understood by the people who would be singing them, so they didn't feel the need to write them down. Those melodies also always fell into 8 modes. You can see them here. You may notice that there are really only 4 modes, and the hypo version of each mode, which started and ended on the 5th scale degree of that given mode. The melody always stayed within that piece's mode, rarely extending above or below by 1 or 2 notes. These narrow and predictable modes made the chants very singable. Then, around 1000 AD, a man named Guido d'Arezzo codified 2 practices that heavily influenced music notation and music reading, and that we still use today, 1,000 years later. One was his system of solmization, or using syllables to represent intervals and steps. That system evolved into the solfege system, or using the syllables do, re, mi, fa, and so on, that we use today. Look out for a video on the origins and evolution of solfege in the future. The other practice was using both the lines and the spaces between them to represent pitches. These earlier pieces were written on 4 lines in a staff instead of 5 lines in a staff. But other than that, the music of 1,000 years ago started to resemble, very strikingly, what we use today. D'Arezzo's solmization, which used the syllable ut, where today we would use the syllable do, sounded like this. Ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and stopped after la. It only used that hexachord, those 6 pitches. It's important to note that those syllables were not fixed to any given pitches, but were movable, much like our solfege system today. But also, they were not necessarily assigned to any given scale degree. So today, we would have do on scale degree 1, or we might have la on scale degree 1 if we're using la-based minor. But back then, this hexachord could be moved around to wherever it was most useful, as long as the intervals of half steps and whole steps matched up within that area of the mode that you were singing in. So any half step would be mi, fa, and you would move the hexachord to fit that situation. It's a bit messy, but it was quite useful once you learned how to do it. Soon after, and by that I mean 150 years later, in the 12th century, a set of 6 rhythmic modes were created. This was the first time they tried to really codify a rhythmic system so that the rhythms of the music became more consistent. But they weren't rhythmic values the way that we think about rhythmic values today. The symbols didn't match up with specific durations, much like a quarter note or an eighth note or a half note do today. Instead, similar to the way that d'Arezzo's hexachord could be moved around within a mode, the different symbols could represent longer or shorter notes depending on how they related to the other notes around them, or how they were grouped together. It was the small groupings and the patterns of those notes that dictated their durations. These were still fairly loose metrically, but they were always in a triple meter. The triple meter was considered perfect, fashioned after the Holy Trinity, and contained groupings of long and short notes. So at this point, we have a system of 8 modes, which is really a system of 4 modes, each with 2 range options, a solmization system to help read the notes in those modes, a staff system with lines and spaces, and a system of rhythmic modes that gives us an indication of long notes and short notes, but that are not fixed in time at all like the system that we use today. While there's a lot more that could be said about this long time period, and we could talk about this for hours, I'd like to focus on just two more people to round this out. First, in about 1280 AD, a German music theorist named Franco de Cologne wrote a treatise called Ars Cantus Mensurabilis, or The Art of Mensurable Music. In it, he described a system of different shaped notes to represent different rhythmic values, the first big shift away from the rhythmic modes of the 12th century and much closer to what we use today. Around 40 years later, in 1320, a French composer and music theorist named Philippe de Vitry wrote a treatise called Ars Nova, or New Art. That became the name of the remainder of the medieval period, making the previous 850 years the Ars Antigua, or Old Art. De Vitry expanded upon de Cologne's rhythmic system, even including some new rhythmic values. These still all mostly fit into what they considered a perfect meter, or a triple meter. So a breve would actually have 3 semibreves, and a semibreve would actually have 3 minims. Whereas today, in modern notation, a breve has 2 semibreves, or what we now call whole notes. And whole notes have 2 half notes, not 3. While we still had not yet reached the modern music notation style that we see today, the music of the 14th and 15th centuries started to become a lot more recognizable. And as we move into the Renaissance period, we can see a direct line between the notation of that time and what we use today. Understanding the needs for notation in the Middle Ages and the steps that were taken along and throughout its evolution have helped me when I look at music today. I hope that it does the same thing for you. In a future video, we'll listen to and look at some different examples of this music. But for now, I'll drop some links in the description below so that you can hear what this music sounded like for yourself. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell to get notifications so you don't miss anything in the future. Slide down into the comments to let me know what you thought, and to also let me know if there's anything else you're interested in me covering in the future. See you next time!